Good afternoon. My name is Ollie Moore and I'm a partner at ERM. I'm excited to be bringing you today the second series of At Home with ERM and KJA webinar series. A lot of you may have joined us over the past couple of months, and you'll know these webinars are designed to bring a set of topics that we hope spark ideas to support you and your organisation to innovate during this difficult time. We've lined up 5 new webinars over the next few weeks, and today we kick off with Toby Whincup, ERM's Asia Pacific mining lead, presenting Mining at the Tipping Point. This is a reflection on the sector's performance, evolving expectations, and how COVID may shape the sector. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today and pay respect to our elders past, present, and emerging. We'll hand over to Toby shortly, but before we do, I'd like to hand over to our facilitator, Raquel, who'll take you through the GoToWebinar platform. Thanks, Raquel.
Thanks very much, Ollie. Good afternoon, everyone. So let me just quickly give you a bit of an orientation around the software that we're going to be using for today's webinar. So firstly, hopefully you'll be able to see a small control panel on your desktop similar to the one on the image in front of you. So important to note, all participants are automatically muted as part of the webinar. The webinar is also being recorded. If you'd like to ask a question, there are 2 ways for you to do that. Firstly, there's the questions icon that appears on your control panel. You can type a question into that icon at any time. So we'll have a presentation first, and then we'll have a Q&A session. But if you do have a question that arises whilst Toby's going through the presentation and content part of the webinar, please feel free to go and type a question in there, and we'll come to that toward the end. And if we don't get to it in the session, we'll be able to come back to you afterwards as well to be able to follow up and get you some answers and have discussion. The raise your hand icon, which is the little hand you'll see there, is what we'll use when we do get to the Q&A session of today's webinar. You'll be able to raise your hand if you have a question to ask, and then I'll be able to unmute your line centrally from here, and you can then verbally ask your question or participate in discussion as we go through. I would also draw your attention to the fact that we are going to have some interactive activities in the webinar today, and to do that, we're going to be using the Poll Everywhere software. So I'd like to take the opportunity now at the beginning to direct you, please, to open up perhaps another tab in your internet browser, or perhaps open your smartphone or tablet if they're nearby, and open up an internet browser session and navigate your way to www.pollev.com/KJA2019. We will have that navigation URL up on the screen again at the times when we're going to be using it for our polls and interactive activities. But please prepare yourselves for that. The questions aren't activated yet inside of the poll software, so if you go to it now, you'll be able to put your name in and it will just say that you'll be waiting, and then you'll be ready to go when we get to those parts of the session. Okay, without any further ado, I will hand over to Toby to take us through today's webinar topic.
Hi everybody, I just thought I'd put my camera on here at the beginning so you know who I am, what I look like, and that I'm not a AI or some sort of internet robot. But I will turn it off now so that you can concentrate on the slides as we go through. Raquel, I'm not seeing any slides up on my screen. Are they there?
Yes, they are. Yep. So
Okay.
That's just come through now, and everyone should be seeing that now.
All right, great. I'm not for some reason, but I will just presume that it's all good and we're ready to go. And we'll see how we go.
Bear with me.
Yep.
Let me just check that that's all coming up for you.
There we go. We've jumped ahead one. Yep. So that has now come through.
Fantastic.
Can we go back to
Great.
the title slide, please?
We sure can. There we go.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much.
Over to you, Toby.
All right. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. As Ollie said, the title is Mining at the Tipping Point, a reflection on the sector's performance, evolving expectations, and how COVID is reshaping the sector. It's probably going to go for about 20-25 minutes. We'll have a few polls, as Raquel said, and then there's questions at the end. In this presentation, sector's performance refers to the sector's ESG and sustainability performance, and the evolving expectations refers to the multiple and complex expectations from the stakeholders that intersect with the mining sector. But before we get into that, I want to reflect on statements that were emerging from the mining companies in the 18 months prior to COVID-19. In them, sustainability and ESG and their importance for the future of mining were front of mind for many of the mining CEOs. It was feeling like a watershed moment for the sector, but was it really? To try and unpack that very question, this webinar is going to explore three key themes: where the statements and actions from the sector prior to COVID-19 were lining up with stakeholder perception, the ability of companies through their positive actions to differentiate themselves from the historic brand of the sector, and the implications of COVID-19 and what role the sector and the companies within it have in building it back better and accelerating action on critical sustainability challenges of this decade. So to do this, we first need to look at the big picture to understand the mining and metals ecosystem and, importantly, the various stakeholders that influence it. Most of you will be familiar with the concept of the mining and metals ecosystem as presented here, that traditional link from extraction to production to waste, and importantly, the emerging importance of the circular economy. The challenge for the sector as we started this decade was twofold: its ability to compete with the circular economy, and also how it is perceived by the stakeholders that sit within, across, and around this mining and metals ecosystem. Can I get you to jump onto that next animation, please, Raquel? There we go. It's a complex, non-linear network of stakeholders that is presented on this slide, each with their own set of criteria of what ESG looks like or what sustainability means and how the mining sector needs to respond. Now, while Australia is faring better than most, COVID-19 has created significant disruption for the sector, given how intricately it's linked to global market supply chains and human resources, the implications of which are still playing out. What is clear, though, even in the early stages of COVID, is that the expectation and vocalization relating to sustainability is not diminishing. Yes, the mining sector is undergoing significant economic shock in many of the commodity groups and geographies, but is also being identified as a key player in the build back of society. To this, we only need to look to the recent announcements on carbon from a number of the major miners who are looking to position the sector as a vanguard for the low carbon economy transition. So we need to ask ourselves the question: does the way mining companies respond to COVID-19 present the opportunity to improve the sector's brand, or perhaps allow mining companies to decouple from the sector's current perception and demonstrate their own advancements? To help answer this question, we first need to look at the sector's aspirations versus the headlines associated with the sector's recent performance. There have been many ambitious and compelling statements made in the 18 months prior to COVID by senior leaders of industry, all about the imperative and the urgency for change. And you'll be familiar with a number of these, but it's things like: we don't own the resources, we only mine them, benefits need to be shared and create value beyond the life of mine. We need to reinvent the industry, change the barbecue conversation, we need to be better at telling our story and the value we bring. Pressures around SDGs are immense and constant, driving the need for changes in the organisations. Companies are competing for access to capital, access to resources, and access to workforce. Sustainability differentiation is a key lever of all of these, and there's many more, all of a similar theme. And many mining companies have committed to and are actioning some material and positive changes in how they are responding to the very real sustainability challenges. But if we juxtapose that against recent headlines, sector's performance continues to be challenged. So this is the ambition versus the reality of the news. The headlines undermine the progress the sector is making and feeds the lack of trust that stakeholders have in mining's promise to do better. This is what we have called the trust gap. And as the trust gap widens, the ability to gain trust back becomes exponentially harder. And we need to ask ourselves, is the mining sector at a tipping point? And as we consider and contemplate that, I'm just going to hand back to Raquel, and we're going to run the first of our 2 polls relating to trust and perception of trust within the industry. Handing back to you, Raquel.
So I'm just going to change the screen for us now and bring us to our poll. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the poll software that you can get to via your browser. Now you can see the link on the screen here. It's pollev.com/KJA2019. You'll be able to see on the screen already that we have a few people who are responding, and it's in real time. We've got a few people there indicating low and medium, quite a number there coming in at high. So let's give that just a few more moments, Toby, and we'll lock that down in a moment to see where we land. So currently, we're now looking at a neck and neck race between medium and high. Still a bit of movement happening there. Let's give it about another 10 seconds for people to think about that question. How trusted is your organisation by its stakeholders? And to indicate whether or not you believe that that is a low, medium or high level of trust. Okay, I think we'll lock that down there. Toby, did you have anything you'd like to comment about that?
Other than generally at an individual company level, there's a sense that there is trust there with regards to stakeholder groups, which is important to see. So let's jump on to the next one if we can, please, Raquel.
Yeah, sure thing. So as we move to the next question, you should see that refreshing on your device or in your browser. And I will activate that. And now it's a similar question, how trusted is, but this time we're talking about the sector as a whole by its stakeholders. So how trusted do you believe is the sector as a whole? Again, nice and simple options, low, medium, or high levels of trust. So take a moment, have a think about that, and plug in your answers into the poll. So far, we're seeing a fairly high level of low ratings for trust in respect of the sector as a whole. Okay, I'll give that probably another five seconds or so for people to plug in their response. All right, Toby, I'll lock that down now. We can all see a 70-30 split between low and medium, but certainly no one putting a plug in for a high level of trust.
So great, that's not surprising, and I think as we go back to the main slides, that's the challenge, right? And the crux of the challenge we're talking about today. So no matter what individual companies do, by trying to do good and approaches and the changes around sustainability, there's this sort of connection to the brand, which continues to impact their ability to seen as differentiating themselves from the brand. It's a real challenge for the sector at the moment. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Raquel. So the trust gap has always been there, but was getting larger towards the end of the last decade, with stakeholders not buying into mining's promise to do good, as that poll would suggest. What is the evidence of this? Well, there's examples from each one of these stakeholder groups that you'll no doubt be familiar with. So human resources. By way of example, mine engineering enrolments in Australia in 2020 was projected to be less than 50. So this is just one example of how the sector is struggling to attract and retain the talent it needs, when a lot of the talent is going to things like technology and those types of sectors. Community disruption continues to delay billions of dollars of capital investment globally, and approval of new projects is harder and takes longer through both the regulatory process and stakeholder pushback. This is currently being played out in Australia with regard to recent loss of heritage sites in WA, and has moved quickly beyond the Pilbara miners into other geographies and other sectors. With regards to customers, as well as traditional industry and technology partners of the sector, these are looking to recycle materials for their products, as these products are seen as having higher ESG credentials. It's not necessarily that they do, it's the perception that they do. So there's a shift towards that circular economy. And equally with investors, they continue to see mining as high risk and are putting increasing pressure on the sector's sustainability credentials. Last year's response on tailings and this year's statement on carbon by the Church of England are two examples of this. And more recently, Norway's $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund excluded a number of mining companies associated with coal production. And as equity markets become more constrained through COVID-19, what will the appetite be for investors to be in a sector that is seen as high risk? The last stakeholder is government, but I'm going to get to the government later on. So just I'll put a hold on there. So how does the sector close the trust gap and edge back from that tipping point? And does COVID present an opportunity for companies to decouple from the sector's brand, or better still, change the brand of the sector? Before we get into this, I just want to quickly reflect on COVID-19 and present some hypotheses in how this may play out, and as such, some of the potential emerging implications to ESG and the sector. Next slide, please, Mel. So ERM defined three distinct phases associated with COVID-19 economic crisis: respond, manage, recover. Each phase has its own unique challenges that companies will need to respond to in order to initially sustain business, but then thrive post-COVID. Some companies are still in the respond phase due to their geographic location, such as those in Latin America or Africa. Others, like those in Australia and Australian-based companies, are well within the managed phase of the pandemic. It's unclear how long the managed phase will last, but it'll be a time of adaptation and transition to a new normal of operation. We expect this to be a catalyst for long-term structural change in how the sector operates, and will be typified by things like adapting and stripping away the levels of bureaucracy that can impede a company's ability to respond to short-term and changing conditions. Also, there'll be increased communication, data sharing, and joint problem solving amongst companies, regulators, community, supply chain, and customers. And remote operability, virtual assessment, and enhanced technology utilization as important but non-critical requirements for operations come back online. This de-bureaucratization and simplification of operations in the earliest stages of manage has been impactful and has proven to companies that they can have sustained, safe, and productive operations under these new conditions. As such, we expect successful initiatives and processes that were prototyped during the manage phase to become widely embedded in organizations. However, as a point of caution, as the sectors move into the recover phase, that last phase of the economic crisis, the challenge will be not to spring back to those old ways of operation. Also, as companies move into the recover phase, they will need to reevaluate the commodity balance in their portfolios and the corresponding capital allocations. We expect M&A activity will see distressed assets change hands, but the smart money will go to the assets that support new growth industries in the post-COVID era. So as we move from manage to recover, I'd like to quickly explore 5 hypotheses about the political and economic landscape and what it may look like post-COVID-19 and the implications this may have on the sector, and equally the role of ESG and what it will play in the resilience of mining companies moving forward. Can you jump to the next slide, please, Mel? So these 5 hypotheses are adapted from a presentation my colleagues from Critical Resources gave at the Gold Forum in April. The insights are drawn from a broad suite of executive engagements within the mining and energy sector, and they are hypotheses. It's important to note that they're not predictions. So the first hypothesis, a period of much deeper geopolitical uncertainty. It remains to be seen whether the crisis will ultimately undermine or enhance international cooperation. Current experience would suggest the former. We witnessed a war of words between countries over the responsibility for the crisis, which have fed existing trade disputes. Restrictions on travel and trade throughout the world will also put further pressure on international relations. And although a G20 attempt to save the world should not be ruled out in the long term, it will require better cooperation than is currently being exhibited. So unfortunately, not a particularly optimistic scenario for the first hypothesis. With regards to the second hypothesis and ESG and climate pressure resurgence, it's clear that ESG is here to stay and the pressure on the climate crisis is not diminishing. That's not a hypothesis. So how will that $9 trillion in global stimulus be spent? When deciding how to deploy stimulus packages, many governments will face pressure to avoid protecting the old economy and invest in sectors that will help combat climate change. However, implementing a broad-scale green transition would require an unprecedented level of international cooperation. And what COVID-19 has exposed is both a global leadership vacuum and economic fragmentation. So what are the implications of this when we look to the bigger challenge of climate change? How do we get collective action on this? Well, this hypothesis would suggest that rather than collective action, we will likely see more piecemeal Green Deal efforts in different countries. So for this hypothesis, there's positivity with regards to ESG and climate change, but we're unlikely to see global consistency or collective action at a government level, which is perhaps where companies step in. The third hypothesis is around governments playing tougher but singing sweeter. Governments are borrowing aggressively to lessen the damage to their economies caused by the pandemic. This debt will eventually need to be repaid, leaving governments under pressure to raise new taxes. Natural resources have always been targets for cash-starved governments. Those most at risk will be those companies that are seen to be performing comparatively well, particularly where they are mining metals and minerals for which prices have remained resilient or flourished as a result of the crisis. So we see resource nationalism as a real risk here for companies. On the flip side, however, is the potential for host governments to make themselves look more attractive for investment by industry players who are either not present or provide an opportunity to differentiate or diversify a country's resource and industry balance. This will increase, however, competition profile for mining companies. The fourth hypothesis is around the new norms of employee behaviour and that getting locked in to how companies operate. So travel restrictions and economic fragmentation may see a need for decentralisation of operations with a greater level of trust and responsibility to in-country leadership. There's also likely a greater requirement for more direct engagement with host country governments, stakeholders and lenders by local leadership. And as supply chains become less globalised, in-country leadership will need to be at the forefront of both development and management of those local supply chains. And the final hypothesis is around the protection of the community health becoming a heavy burden for companies. Cost of companies getting its COVID response wrong is very high. Should employees become infected, then there will be a need for radical change in shift requirements and potentially operational close down. We've thankfully escaped this issue in Australia so far, but we're seeing this play out in other parts of the world already. Additionally, if host or Indigenous communities are impacted by COVID as a result of an operation, then there is also very real reputational and legal exposure to those companies. So that's the 5 hypotheses. And in very general terms, those mining companies which have with strong and embedded ESG credentials appear to have fared better in the earliest stages of COVID-19, with parallels between ESG performance and business resilience being evident. So as we move from a global health crisis into a global economic crisis, what does this mean for mining? Is this the opportunity to look at the industry and its role in building back better? The following couple of slides are going to suggest a framework in which we can do that. Mel, can you jump to the next slide, please? Thank you. For mining companies to be sustainable, they need to create and protect value for all stakeholders. And to create and protect value, they need to have sustainability credentials that get ahead of stakeholder expectations. In the lead up to COVID-19, although there was a lot of messaging and action relating to sustainability and ESG, There's no simple message. At a minimum, each company was expected to be legally and lender compliant, aligned to one or more industry initiatives, report against a number of global platforms, benchmark and measure themselves against a myriad of ESG rating mechanisms. Doing this, the implications of business value and accessibility of a message to stakeholder groups was becoming evident. Specifically, was this significant investment in establishing frameworks and compliance around all of these requirements providing material benefit and value to companies? And the ability to develop a simple and transparent message relating to sustainability was difficult and at times confusing. By trying to please everyone, companies were running the risk of pleasing no one and in doing so feeding that trust gap. Can you click onto the animation, please? There we go, excellent. So in response to this, ERM has developed a blueprint for sustainable mining as a means of trying to bring clarity, simplicity, and priority to sustainability in the mining sector. The key philosophy behind the mine we want to see is that it seeks to establish a sustainable metals ecosystem for mining companies, communities, customers, and investors through responsible mining. It guides the journey to safe, efficient, inclusive, and technology-enabled mining practices from exploration through to closure to deliver societal and commercial value. This has evolved over the last 18 months, and we feel is something that is more relevant now than it ever has been. So what does it look like? And why do we believe it's an important mechanism to help close that trust gap? Okay, there are 6 elements which will become evident through this slide, which we see as fundamental to building sustainable mining practices. These can work individually, but are far stronger when part of a collective strategy. It's all about building holistic programs that work for your company and enables you to be more strategic about societal expectations and builds trust across that stakeholder ecosystem. I'll touch on these very briefly. The first one is mine planning and operational excellence. So ensuring safe, productive, and transparent operations from exploration to closure, including partnerships with companies across that ecosystem. In light of COVID, there also needs to be clear understanding of what needs to be reset with regards to working environments to minimize not only COVID-related risks, but also the resultant operational risks of workforces and work practices reshape and evolve. The second one is water custodianship and using a holistic approach and scientific evidence to develop and build sustainable water management plans from mine design through to closure. And importantly, working with other stakeholders in your catchment on collective approaches to water management. The third is social and economic performance, achieving continuous consent of your rights holders, host communities, and other stakeholders through engagement, managing social risk, and driving socio-economic development. Fourth, product stewardship, and developing and implementing programs that responsibly and strategically manage environmental and social risks across the metal and minerals value chain. Second last one is carbon and energy, and developing and implementing strategies to decarbonize your business, as well as understand and respond to market needs in a low carbon economy. And the final one is closure and regeneration, and that integration of environmental, social, regional, and post-mining land use considerations across your entire mining life cycle, not just in the last couple of years of a mine's operation. Now, the role of data and transparent reporting is critical to all of this. Let's take carbon and energy as one example. It is one thing for companies to publicly state their intentions and targets relating to Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but their credibility will quickly be called into question if they are not in a position to collect, collate, and be transparent about their progress towards those goals. So this blueprint provides a simple and strategic framework to address and manage the complex ESG challenges faced by the sector within the mining and metals ecosystem, and equally that mechanism to bridge that trust gap. So I'm just going to pass back to Raquel now, and I want to get your perspectives on acknowledge and recognize that these 6 frameworks or pillars working together create an integrated approach to sustainable performance. But I want to get your sense of which of those you see as the most important. So I'll hand over to Raquel now.
Thanks very much for that, Toby. So I'll direct everyone back to your Poll Everywhere browser. If you could go, as I said, onto your tablet, smartphone, or onto the additional browser you've opened. And what we have now is those 6 pillars in shorthand that Toby has just gone through with us in that last slide. What you have the opportunity to do in this particular poll is to rank them in order of priority. So there's 6 there, and what you can do is you can tap or click on each of them, and an arrow up and down will appear. So you can raise or lower the ranking for each of those items. So there's 6 there, and we'd love to see how you position them first through to 6th. And we'll be able to see on the screen how they come up collectively from all of those of you who are participating in the activity. And we'll see that change as we get different responses coming in. So I'll give you a few moments because this activity will take a little bit longer than the last one. And again, just letting you know you've got 6 options. If you click on each one, and an up and down arrow will appear, and you'll be able to raise or lower the rank of each of those pillars. We've had a few shifts here, but we are seeing it stabilize a little. So currently we're seeing social and economic performance coming up higher. And coming in 6th, product stewardship. A little bit of change there between water custodianship and mine planning, but again, fairly stable. Let's give it another 20 seconds or so, because it is, as I said, it's a bit more to be thinking about here, and certainly trying to capture out of 6 really important elements how you would rank them, and forcing that from a 1 through to a 6. Okay. It's looking fairly stable now. And Toby, we now have a draw for 5th. For those people who are, oh, no, someone's just hit submit and we've gone back. Closure and regeneration coming in 6th at this point in time. All right, I'm going to give it like 10 more seconds, and then I'll close that down. And Toby, you can have a chat then about where we're landing with the 6 pillars.
Okay, great. Thanks, Raquel. And okay, so
There we go.
no real surprises for me there around the top 2. I am quite surprised about closure and regeneration, given all the talk through the sector around it in the last sort of couple of years. I'm surprised that's come in at 6, but maybe it's just a reflection of people's roles in their companies at the moment. So let's jump back to the slides. I'll quickly finish off. There's 2 more slides, and then we can go to questions. So if you can jump onto the next slide, please, Raquel, that'd be great. There we go. So this is the second last. Yep, we got it. Thank you. This is the second last slide, and I just want to highlight a few examples of how our blueprint can help bridge that trust gap, and how each of the 6 elements works either singularly, but is far more impactful as a combination. So take community trust as an example. Bridging the trust gap with communities through transparency, value sharing, and empowerment links to our approach to social and economic performance. Combining this with our closure and regeneration strategy provides the foundation for communities to have input into and ownership of their community's economic future post-mining. Second example is the interplay between 6 elements in the investor stakeholder group. Investors need to manage their risks, as we've already said, and look to companies that can prove their ESG credentials across their value chain as a mechanism of reducing that investment risk profile. So mining companies that have transparent strategies around scenario planning for climate change and water, and have host communities as advocates, will be more attractive to investors than those companies that can't do this. So finishing, are we seeing a tipping point? If we look back over the last 18 months, there's been some significant progress made by companies in their response to the global sustainability challenges, but the headlines continue to undermine those actions. For most effective and sweeping change in the sector, each company needs to be accountable to their public statements by demonstrating consistent and collective efforts to close the trust gap. And as tragic and as disruptive as COVID-19 has been, Does it present that circuit breaker for the sector and the role it can play in building back better? So in closing, there's 4 key messages that I'd like you to take from today's presentation. COVID provides an opportunity for companies to reset and simplify their ESG strategy. In doing so, their approach to how they communicate their sustainable performance to their stakeholders. However, COVID-19 disruption means response timeframes are significantly reduced. Annualizing information and strategy is no longer appropriate, and the lines between tactical and strategic actions are really starting to blur. The third point is that the mind we want to see, or looking at your current roadmap through a similar lens, is a simple way to focus on the things you can control and the way you can engage with the various stakeholders across that minings and metals ecosystem. And the fourth and final part is that blueprint helps simplify the message. It makes it accessible to stakeholders and creates a level of transparency that can build trust. So I hope there was something in there for everyone over the last 30 minutes. We've got some time now for questions, so I'll go on mute and hand over to Raquel again to facilitate the Q&A. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Toby. As you said, certainly a lot there for us to be thinking about, and hopefully generating some questions or indeed some discussion points. So now is the opportunity, if you would like, to raise your hand to pose a question to Toby or introduce a discussion point that's of relevance and interest to you in regard to this topic. You can do that by clicking on the hand icon on your control panel. Alternatively, you can also type in a question if you'd like to do that, and we can respond in that way also. So while you're having some thoughts around what questions you may like to ask verbally, when you do raise your hand, I can come to you and unmute your line. We do have a question that's come in through the written question box. So Toby, the question we have is this: water stewardship is absolutely critical in Australia, a desert continent. Would this equate to land use management or air quality in other more congested environments? So Toby, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, it's a thank you, whoever asked that question. It's a really tough one. So I don't have the answer to that around air quality, but what I will say, and it may or may not sort of go some way to answering the question, is there's going to be more and more onus around public health, and we're seeing that already, and the implications of mine operations around public health. And in Australia, there's a lot of remote mining, but you're right, in other parts of the world, there's a lot of communities around mine sites. Well, there is in Australia, actually, if you look at Kalgoorlie, for example. So you're going to have to be able to prove that you are doing whatever you can to protect public health. So it's evolved from work health to public health. So I think, yes, airshed quality is an emerging issue, and we've seen implications in Australia around it already. You look at some of the stuff in WA around ports and stuff in Queensland and New South Wales around coal and coal dust. So it's an issue. It's something that needs to be understood and managed, and I think is an area of sustainability. And I think that feeds into that first pillar of our blueprint around the operational performance and mine planning and operational excellence, and maintaining good practice with regards to what's going on outside of the fence as within the fence. So that's probably not answered well, but I hope goes some way to answering that question.
Thanks, Toby. We do have another question that's come in over our written questions, and it is this. You mentioned how important it is for a company to be able to demonstrate their trend towards carbon reduction. What do you think are the most effective ways to do this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think with anything, not just carbon reduction, but any of the elements we've touched on today, there needs to be a mechanism to be transparent around your data. So if we take those emissions, what we do tend to find when we look at things like this is, first of all, the data is not captured well. So first of all, we need to be able to capture your data well. And then once we look at how to capture data well, we often find that actually the data's not showing the whole picture. So it's either some of the data is incorrect or some of the required data is not being captured. So you need to be able to capture all the required data well, and then ensure it's and validate it. And then once you've done that, you're in a position to report it, because once you report it and once you want to be transparent about it, it's open to everybody obviously to look at and test, and people will test it. So that data integrity is critical before you can sort of start being transparent around it. As for the best mechanism of being transparent about it, we're exploring options around blockchain as a mechanism of providing a single point of truth for things like carbon reporting. So if you look particularly in the value chain and your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, you're going to need a coalition of the willing, but you are going to need that mechanism for all parties across that value chain to provide that data into that profile and show that progress around your emissions reductions. And we think that blockchain does provide that opportunity. So that's something we're exploring at the moment.
Thanks, Toby. We have a number of questions coming in the written section, which is fantastic. We've got time, I think, for probably one more answer. And then for anyone else that's got some questions coming in, please do keep them coming, because we are able to come back to you after the session and continue that conversation around the questions that you're asking. So the one that I have here, Toby, is how aligned do you feel the government and mining expectations are with local communities to fill the trust or performance gap?
Yeah, good question. A difficult one. What I will say is that if we look at what COVID is presenting to both society and industry and government, it is providing a real mechanism and catalyst for those 3 stakeholder groups to come together better than they probably have historically to work through collaborative solutions. So it's not a socialist society we're moving towards, although if you look towards what Australia's done in the Liberal government, that would make your most hardcore socialist blush, I think, with regards to some of the stimulus packages they've put forward. But I think there is this opportunity now to get those 3 groups around a table and really sort of present and work through mechanisms to ensure that industry, mining in this case, can create that mechanism to build society back, and in doing so, do it in a way that helps transition and respond to this climate crisis that the globe is faced with. And that, of course, is going to be very different depending on the host governments, and will be a challenge for global mining companies as they have to navigate the very varied expectations and response to what governments are wanting to do and how they're going to want to initially stimulate the economy through this $9 trillion worth that's going into the globe, and equally find a mechanism to pay that back, and equally get people employed and get the economy and society moving forward post this massive initial health and now global economic shock.
Thanks very much, Toby. Okay, everyone, that is bringing us toward the close of our session. As I said, there are still a couple of questions there in our questions box. We will come back to you separately outside the webinar to answer and to engage with you on those. So thank you so very much for that interaction. Just before we close, I would like to draw your attention to the following 4 topics that we have in this series of webinars presented to you by ERM and KJA. You'll see those listed there in front of you. We have another one next week on the circular economy. And we've already sent out the invitations to these. If you'd like to receive it, if you haven't, please do reply on the invitation from today's, and we can get that to you. They're also posted up on our LinkedIn web pages as well. So thank you all very much for your attendance and for your participation. It's been lovely having you with us today. We're delighted that you could join us for this time. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you and goodbye.